Welcome to The Scope with Dr. K. I'm Dr. Kosinski. We're going to open the show today, as we always do, by stating that the goal is to present you with a broad scope of value-based care issues. Today, we are beginning a new series devoted to wraparound services that benefit patients with GI disorders. We will be doing 3 podcasts in this series, beginning with today's show, which is dedicated to behavioral health issues. The other 2 will be focused on nutritional issues and sleep disorders that interfere with circadian rhythms. Our guest is Dr. Laurie Keefer, professor of medicine and psychiatry at Mount Sinai's Icahn School of Medicine. She is a GI psychologist and is co-founder of Trellus Health, a telehealth-based multidisciplinary care management platform providing access to expert-driven personalized care for complex chronic conditions like IBD. Laurie is a health psychologist specializing in the integration of behavioral health care into GI settings with a broader passion for the emerging field of psychogastroenterology. Her main focus is inflammatory bowel disease, so she's going to be perfect for our show today. She has oversight of the psychobehavioral research of a large, over 12,000 patient population of IBD patients at Mount Sinai, where she addresses the needs of young adults with IBD and how best to personalize self-management interventions using health technology. She's also the inventor of the GRITT IBD method, which risk stratifies and elevates psychosocial care among IBD patients, those with the poorest outcomes. It is this technology that led to the formation of Trellus Health, which she co-founded with Dr. Marla Dubinsky. Welcome to the show, Laurie.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. K. This is really exciting to be able to share my passion.
Well, you know what? I plan on that. I love passionate guests for the show. So I'm going to start out by just giving you an opportunity to tell the listeners about your career. How did you get to where you are now? I'm happy to note that you spent much of your training right here in Chicago at
Yes.
Northwestern and at Rush, but tell the listeners how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, it's funny. I always joke it's both accidental and intentional at the same time. So, I've always, even since I've been a little girl, been really fascinated with the mind-body connection. And so when I started in graduate school and was first sort of exposed to the brain-gut connection, it was really a perfect way for me to get some depth of knowledge around, that issue. And my mentor in graduate school was an expert in behavioral intervention science, so sort of being able to apply behavioral techniques to problems. And at the time, we didn't really do that so much to medical conditions, right? We were still sort of really thinking about problems like worry and depression and anxiety. So that was where I got my start. As a health psychologist, we do residencies and postdocs, and I happened to be matched to Rush Medical Center there in Chicago for at the time, really one of the few health psych programs. We didn't really have health psychologists yet in the country. And so there I was exposed to all sorts of ways in which he took that behavioral intervention science and applied it to chronic diseases. And for me, it was a no-brainer, right? Because I was already excited about the brain and the gut. So that was sort of led me to this GI psych concept. Initially started more in the IBS space, honestly. It was an easier sell, right? At the time, this was in the early 2000s, where our treatments for IBD were still, kind of focused on, our time to flare versus remission. If you had symptoms, it was driven by inflammation. So I spent a lot of time more in the development of these brain gut behavior therapies. My first NIH grant was actually in hypnotherapy, applying it to inflammatory bowel disease, being able to show that we could prolong clinical symptom remission in people who underwent a brain gut intervention. So that was sort of the beginning of that excitement I had in self-management interventions in IBD.
I always smile a little bit and smirk when I think about the fact that my first exposure to inflammatory bowel disease as a medical student back in the 70s was in my psychiatry rotation.
Really? Yep.
So at that point, They were thinking this was a psychosomatic illness, and in many ways they're not wrong because the behavioral issues can trigger horrible flares of disease. I've taken care of patients in the course of my career that went into major flares following major emotional occurrences in their life. So
Absolutely. And now we have that sort of more science showing sort of the inflammatory immune pathway of mental health conditions too, right? And so things like depression and anxiety often sit on the same pathways as all sort of colitis and Crohn's. So now it makes so much more sense. But yeah, at the time, it was very psychosomatic based.
yeah, but the gut brain axis is a new term today
Yes.
that is really getting a lot of press. How did you wind up in IBD? You said you started more with IBS, which makes sense, but how did you migrate so heavily into IBD?
Yeah, so I started to sort of see IBD patients as a fellow and early faculty at Rush, and realized that a lot of the same principles applied, even though you had this added layer, right, of disease severity and biologic medication and all that. And I thought, this is the quintessential health psych condition, really, because you have very clear biological and physiological pathways. You have inflammation, you have immune function, which in and of itself is related to stress. And then you have these young people often who are being told they have to change their lives, and that requires behavior change, right? No matter what we do, there's no pill for getting somebody to actually make a change in their lifestyle. And so it really was an area that hadn't really been thought of in health psychology necessarily. But really, if you think of all the principles of health psychology around applying behavior change to medical conditions, it was like perfect. With me, anything I know more about, I get more excited about. For me, it's about the depth of knowledge. And so the other thing that appealed was really digging deep into a single condition or, a set of conditions, really understanding the patient experience and then designing tools for people to thrive.
Well, we've definitely noticed in our sonar work the increased cost of care in patients who have behavioral health issues, and specifically those that are having active symptoms, not necessarily those who just have a past history of it, but those who have active symptoms. And I know you've done a lot of work on this, and you developed the GRITT IBD method.
Yeah.
Give us some good detail on what this method is.
Yeah, absolutely. So GRIT stands for gaining resilience through transitions. And the idea really kind of came from, my observations clinically, but also, research wise, to really look at people with inflammatory bowel disease and seeing like, who are the people that actually have terrible disease, but still manage to like get up with a smile on their face every day and go to work, right? And who are the people who, have terrible disease, or maybe they don't even have that terrible a disease, but have just sort of become, crushed by their diagnosis. And I really saw this sort of 2 to 3 different phenotypes of people and really thought about how can we capture those personal characteristics, those strengths or limitations that people have well before they go on to develop depression and anxiety, right? Can I intervene at this much earlier point? And so the framework of resilience actually comes from the world of positive psychology, which is, this idea of why do people flourish? Why do people thrive? How do people bounce back despite adversity? And again, IBD is a perfect example of a adverse experience that happens to somebody often early in their life before they've had any real adversity that they've had to work with. And what my science kind of showed over the years, I've been building this case almost that what do people actually need to have in place before we ask them to do anything related to their disease management. So those characteristics kind of formed this what we call Resilience 5 as part of the GRITT method. Disease acceptance, right? So recognizing that you have the condition, that it's lifelong, that you're, even if you don't approve of it or you feel bad that you have it, that you still have to deal with it. Right. And so many of the interventions we've had to develop as part of the GRITT method focus on building that acceptance. The other is optimism. It's more than just glass half empty, half full. It's how do you attribute the causes of good and bad events in your life? And so how do we get people to cognitively reset the way they're interpreting their disease so that they're willing to work towards making their lives better instead of just viewing it as devastating and personal and pervasive? We've seen that the ability to self-regulate. I know we've talked in the past about our dogs, right? But our dogs, have to figure out strategies to be able to regulate situations that are not comfortable or that they're not sure about, right? And that might be that they sit down and they wait for commands. But, how do we teach people to self-regulate these uncomfortable symptoms, these uncomfortable procedures? How do you even wait for the start of a medication with your while you're waiting for your payer to approve? How do you tolerate that anxiety if I need to start a drug now and I have to wait a month before I can get it on? So those are all skills that people have to have. Social support is really critical to managing and buffering against stress, as well as, people need people when they have adversity in their lives. And then finally, the fifth of the resilience characteristics as part of the GRITT method is that self-efficacy, self-confidence, right? So I'm confident that I can learn whatever I have to learn. If I need to learn to swallow a pill, if I need to learn a new way to do yoga because I have an ostomy bag, I can do it. Someone can teach me to do it, and I can do it, and my life can move on from it. I'm confident in that. And so the GRITT method really focuses on, out of the gate, do you have what it takes to be able to do what is asked of you over your lifetime, over the course of your disease, no matter what changes you might go through in your life? And that goes back to that, using transitions in care as an opportunity to build skills and resilience.
Listening to you describe the GRITT method, it makes me think that just about every patient with IBD ought to have that presented to them early in the course of their disease.
Yes.
One of my observations in starting Sonar was that there were so many patients who just accepted the condition, but didn't recognize when their condition was deteriorating. How does that fit into your GRITT methodology?
That's 100% right. So that is that, settling for conditions, and, the flip side of acceptance is avoidance. And so when we don't accept, like really accept, not just like, yes, I know, checkbox, I have a condition, but really accept that we have to pay attention to ourselves. A lot of patients will avoid reaching out to their providers. They avoid going in for their procedures. They don't want to deal with it because they don't accept it. And they conflate acceptance with approval. And I really try to make that point of, you don't have to approve of it. You don't have to like it. But if you're having more symptoms, it's your responsibility to let your doctor know, right? To reach out to people and let them help you, or to treat you. You don't have to settle for debilitating symptoms, right? And a lot of times people settle because they're avoiding learning more about what's possible. They're afraid. And that's where that acceptance really, I would say starting there is so critical at the point of diagnosis.
Very interesting. Tell us, Laurie, about Trellus Health. So here's your opportunity. All right, kiddo.
My shameless plug, right?
So this is your shameless plug for your company.
So, as you know, I'm at Mount Sinai, and, even though I've been doing this work for 20, 25 years, looking at, the GRITT method and all of that really kind of came to fruition at Mount Sinai in our IBD home, right? And we were able to show reductions when people had those resilience 5 behaviors, and we worked towards getting them to that point. We saw dramatic reductions, as you have seen in Sonar, right? right? With just a little bit of extra support, you can move the needle on unplanned care, ED visits, hospitalizations. We saw improvements in opioid use, steroid use, all of that. So Mount Sinai kind of came to Dr. Dubinsky and I and said, this is like, your outcomes are like really amazing. Is there an opportunity here to, scale this, through technology, or, how do we make sure that people that live in, New Jersey across the bridge that can't come to Mount Sinai can still access this amazing opportunity, right? That get this wraparound care. And so that Mount Sinai kind of invested in us to set up and accelerate a way of commercializing this GRITT method, which ended up becoming the basis of Trellus. So the GRITT method was licensed to Trellus for IBD, as well as, we're only in IBD right now, but, obviously thinking about the applicability to several other chronic conditions, right? I mean, especially this Resilience 5 challenge. And so from there, so Mount Sinai was an investor, and then we were able to secure funding through the London Stock Exchange as well. So the alternative investment market, and be able to sort of spend the last 2 years building the technology to deliver that GRITT method. And it's different. One of the things I've learned as a new, and I know you and I have talked about this, sort of an entrepreneur, being from a clinician to being an entrepreneur, right, is to sort of begin to think about, how do you keep your science stable, your methodology, your beliefs, your philosophy, but figure out a way to deliver it in a way that patients can access it and receive those services? So we have a licensed care team that's sort of behind the scenes, because we are a wellness company. So we're not providing care. We're not disintermediating care for people with gastrointestinal conditions. But that team is really helping decide and assessing where somebody is in their resilience journey and what skills they may need, what symptoms they may struggle with, and putting together a personalized roadmap. And so our members basically come into the platform, they get they do an assessment that we've really perfected, more so from Trellus than even we did at the Sinai IBD Center. And then they get their customized roadmap, and then they have access to a couple different options. There's tons of digital content, most of which was developed by me or grad students of mine, based on years and years of experience treating patients with this condition. They can get access to a variety of nutritional content. Again, not to just download a nutrition app because they want to try low FODMAPs, but curated nutritional content chosen by a dietitian for their particular needs. What we don't want is people spinning their wheels. And, so many of our IBD patients are desperate for treatment, and we don't want to take advantage of that desperation and give them things that aren't going to help them. And they also get a variety of self-regulatory techniques. So obviously there's a playlist, if you will, of relaxation and coping statements and grounding exercises that they can access in real time at the doctor's office, that type of thing. So that's what they can kind of do on their own. But we don't want to separate out the human touch, because that's still really important, that social support piece, that ability to guide people. So our members also work with a coach. They have unlimited coaching, whether that's secure messaging, video, telehealth. They can, we're sort of still learning as a company what people want and how they want that information done. They get unlimited visits with a IBD dietitian. And they unlimited. Yep.
Okay.
Because, again, access is such a critical piece of this, right? Mm-hmm. And then they also can have unlimited visits as needed, what they perceive to be needed, with a nurse educator. So, again, we're really trying to support the patients, but we're also trying to support the providers, right? So that you as a provider, our provider groups that maybe don't have these services can offload some of that disease education and, why was I prescribed this medication? Doesn't it cause cancer? And, all of those things. So, so the members get that as well. And they're sort of participating in the programming pretty intensively for 3 to 6 months. And then from there, we kind of step them down, keep them engaged, keep giving them new tools and contents. But we're really facilitating behavior change. So this isn't like you have to do this. We're not just, sending them information that doesn't make sense. It's very, very curated. And and we're right now it's a subscription model, direct to consumer. So $49 a month will get you that.
Okay. That was one of my questions, but how does a patient hear about this? How does a patient access it? Is it something that you're distributing through GI practices? How are you getting your message out to the consumer other than from this podcast?
Yes, that's a great question. So, we have a couple different channels because we have been direct to consumer now for about 3 weeks. We are just seeing people that basically hear about it or, hear, through things like your podcast or what have you. Right. And those individuals with IBD, they just go to, patients.trellushealth.com and they can get their free resilience assessment, sign up for their navigator just straight out of the gate. But we're recognizing that really where the benefit is to all stakeholders, and this goes back to that value-based care, is for us to really kind of partner with large practices that are seeing high volumes of patients who are maybe even in at-risk contracts that want their patients to be able to address these disease interfering management behaviors because it's going to save them on the other end. So we have a lot of relationships with those groups. Honestly, even the academic medical centers can't keep up with their mental health volume, even if they have health psychologists. Like, I was at Northwestern for a while, there's 4 health psychologists there, for example, but even they can't keep up with the needs and the demands of these patients, right? And not everyone needs to see a psychologist either. So from a value, again, being able to put these patients that health systems are seeing into Trellus to save the people who have, more complex, one-on-one, they need a doctoral level mental health provider. So that's the other sort of strategy that we've been kind of doing. We'd love to work in the pharma space a little bit, certainly with the payers, as you have successfully done. It's harder to get into that because of the type of philosophy that we're offering. And that we're not.
But you have a clear ability to have a distribution channel through the GI practices, and I would imagine, Laurie, that the private practices are going to be in need of your services even more than the academic institutions.
Absolutely.
Northwestern may have 4 psychologists, but most GI practices have 0. So,
right.
I can see, and I like the fact that you're not disintermediating the care that the doctor. So do you provide information back to the patient's physician?
Yep. So the way we've set it up is obviously the patient has to agree, but when they sign up, we notify, as long as the patient agrees, we notify the provider that the patient is a member of Trellus, and the provider also gets the opportunity to opt in to receive information, right? Because we recognize that not all providers, I personally think they should, but not all providers want to hear all that information. But so the provider has a dashboard where they can track who of their patients are enrolled, what they're working on. We do have all sorts of notifications that you can kind of customize and set up for yourself. Like, do you want to know when your patient has rising abdominal pain for several days? We have that sort of the ability to track. If you as a provider recommended your patient start on Zeposia, maybe they're pushed the content that your patient needs an EKG, so that if you're not even an IBD specialist, right, you might still be able to feel a little more comfortable in managing that IBD patient in the community, because Trellus has that those guardrails in place around up-to-date gold standard best practices. And again, this is where those quality metrics come in, right?
I see. Okay. Well, my final question, this this show is all about value. So
Yes.
let's end this show with a focus on how behavioral health adds value, not only to the health plans and the payers, but to the providers and the patients. So put your value hat on
Yep.
and give us your concept as to how what you're doing both at Mount Sinai and what you're doing with Trellus are adding value.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. We are the way that I think of value, right, is the ability for patients and providers to have a relationship in which each of them is moving towards healing, right? And that is for me both mucosal healing, but also emotional healing, because when that happens, both patients and providers are happier and healthier, right? I mean, provider burnout is a whole nother conversation, right? And so the value here is that we are actually helping patients get more out of their visits, execute between visits, so that when they are visiting with their provider, it's much more productive and value can be created, and not so focused on all the barriers to executing on treatment plans that happen because of human factors. So I think that's one area of value. The other is, and you've done a lot of research on this too, is that engagement of patients, right? Because providers can take the horse to water, but if the patient does not engage in self-management skills, the provider gets dinged on their poor outcomes. But it's sort of like my parents were both teachers, and it's like, are they responsible here for all the things going on at home on their standardized tests? And I think the same thing we do for providers is we hold them to these metrics when there's a whole bunch of factors that are outside of their control. And that's what, both what we do at Mount Sinai, we're there to support the providers and making sure the patient moves from A to B and get rid of all those barriers. And that's what Trellus is trying to do as well.
Well, Laurie, you've embarked upon a new phase of your career, and I wish you all the luck in the world with this. I certainly do. I think it's very, very important for the care of these patients that their behavioral health needs are addressed. I thank you very much for coming on the show today. And so in addition to thanking you, I'm going to thank the audience for tuning in. You can learn more about the show on the program's page on healthcarenowradio.com. And lend your voice to the conversation on Twitter at HCNowRadio. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at SonarMD. We're bringing patients, providers, and payers together to reimagine GI care. Until next time, I'm Dr. K. Stay well.